Gavin Newsom tried to ambush Denzel Washington live on national television. Seconds later, it backfired. Hard. One sentence dropped like a quiet thunderclap, and Newsom was never the same. The smirk faded, the debate shifted, and the country saw something real. Live. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the moments they don't want you to notice. The moderator welcomed millions of viewers to what had been billed as a defining conversation on leadership, ethics, and public trust. But beneath the polished opening and practiced smiles, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Senator Gavin Newsom leaned into the mic with purpose. This wasn't just another debate for him. After months of trying to contain a scandal involving questionable campaign finances, tonight was either redemption or retribution. And his target was clear: Denzel Washington. As the moderator began introducing the opening themes, viewers at home could feel it, the mood tightening. This wasn't a policy discussion, it was a showdown. Newsom struck first, his tone sharp, formal, but laced with subtle contempt. "Mr. Washington," he said with a measured smirk, "you speak so often about integrity. But tell us, how do you define that word when your supporters include billionaires who profit while working families struggle?" Denzel didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded, calm, centered, silent, just long enough to make Newsom uncomfortable. Then he spoke. "Integrity," Denzel said, his voice even and low, "is doing the right thing when nobody's watching. And Senator, that includes telling the truth, even when it's inconvenient." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The studio went silent. Newsom quickly pivoted. He listed policies, dodged into old votes, offered vague allegations, anything to force Denzel off balance. But Denzel didn't play. He listened, measured, focused. While Newsom danced in circles, Denzel remained still, like a man holding a final truth, just waiting. By the end of the first segment, the momentum had shifted. Newsom, once confident, now looked unsettled. Denzel had said little, but it felt like he'd said everything. And just when viewers began to wonder if this would amount to anything, it did. Because what came next wasn't a counterattack. It wasn't clever, it wasn't loud. It was one sentence that stopped the entire debate. But not just yet. The second round began with a question that had followed Newsom for weeks: financial transparency. "Senator Newsom," the moderator asked, "recent reports suggest inconsistencies in your latest re-election campaign funding. How do you respond to concerns about undisclosed donations?" Newsom's smile tightened. He had prepared for this moment. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "Every dollar was accounted for under the law. What we're seeing here is a distraction, a political hit job meant to shift focus from the real issues facing the American people." It was classic: redirect, deflect, attack. What he didn't anticipate was that Denzel wouldn't interrupt, wouldn't raise his voice, wouldn't take the bait. He just watched and waited. It was a classic political maneuver: redirect, deflect, accuse. But Gavin Newsom hadn't anticipated what came next. Denzel Washington wouldn't jump in. He wouldn't interrupt. He simply listened. Still, silent. And when the moderator finally turned to him, the entire stage seemed to still. "Mr. Washington," she asked, "do you believe these allegations against Senator Newsom should be taken seriously?" Denzel looked directly into the camera, his voice low and measured. "I believe the American people deserve answers. Not from me, not from headlines, but from the senator himself. Transparency isn't a political weapon. It's a responsibility." The audience leaned in. Viewers at home sat upright. It wasn't loud, but it hit something raw. Newsom fired back. His polished demeanor hardened into something more aggressive. "You talk about transparency?" he snapped. "Let's talk about your silent when your wealthy donors benefit from deregulation. Where's your integrity in that?" Still no response, no flinch, no change in Denzel's expression. And that silence cut sharper than any rebuttal. What Newsom didn't realize was that he was walking directly into Denzel's rhythm. Because every jab, every accusation wasn't shaking Denzel, It was exposing Newsom, letting him dig his own hole. And people noticed. Social media lit up. Clips were already spreading. Hashtags flooded the screen mid-broadcast. Hashtag Washington, unshaken, Newsom pressed. Truth, over him, spin backstage. Campaign staff grew restless. Newsom's aides whispered frantically into earpieces. Meanwhile, Denzel, calm, focused, still waiting. The moderator, sensing the heat rising, changed topics. But the damage had begun. Newsom's tone had shifted, less confident, more defensive. His answers came quicker, but with less weight. Denzel stayed consistent. Wait. Listen. Speak with precision. Then came the moment no one expected. Newsom tried to pivot again, this time into a vague, sentimental story about his upbringing. That's when Denzel finally cut in. Not loud, not rude, just enough to shift the air. "Senator," he said quietly, "we all have stories, but this debate isn't about your past. It's about what you're doing now." It landed like a quiet blow. Honest, direct, no flair, no venom, just truth. And again, Newsom was thrown off rhythm. The camera cut to a wide shot. Two men, two styles, one unraveling, one waiting. But still, the sentence, the one that would change everything, hadn't been said. Not yet. The tension inside the studio was now visible. Newsom leaned forward more often, his voice rising slightly, his pace quickening. He was grasping, trying to seize back control, not just of the debate, but of the narrative. He dove into a list of proposals on economic justice. Numbers, endorsements, buzzwords. It was supposed to display command, but instead it sounded like noise. Denzel didn't even blink. The moderator delivered the next question with a sharper tone. "Mr. Washington, do you believe your opponent has demonstrated the character necessary to lead in this political climate?" It was bait, an open invitation to strike. But Denzel didn't take it. "Character," he said, "isn't about what we say when the lights are on. It's about the decisions we make when they're off. The public doesn't need more finger-pointing. They need honesty, humility, and the courage to admit when we've fallen short." There it was again, steady, honest, restrained. The kind of answer that lingers. Newsom scoffed, audibly. "Humility?" he repeated with a smirk. "You sit there acting above it all, while your allies benefit from backdoor deals, and you say nothing. You want to talk about character? Let's start there." But Denzel didn't flinch, because he wasn't reacting. He was waiting. "If we're going to talk character," Newsom said, voice tightening, "then let's talk facts." With a performative flourish, he pulled out a document, just high enough for the cameras to catch. Theatrical, calculated. "This," he declared, holding it like a prop, "is proof that Mr. Washington once co-chaired a fund that lobbied against consumer protections." The room stirred. Producers backstage shifted nervously. The moderator leaned forward, asking for clarification. But Denzel Washington didn't move. He waited. Let Newsom finish. Let him commit. Then quietly, Denzel asked one question. "Did you read the second page?" Silence. Newsom blinked. "Excuse me?" Denzel remained calm, clear. "The second page of that report states that the lobbying effort you're referencing was never approved by the board. I was part of that board, Senator, and I voted against it. That's public record." The moderator, glancing at her notes, quickly confirmed. "That is accurate. Mr. Washington dissented in the vote." For a beat, Newsom stood there, exposed. His mouth opened, but no words came out. It was the first time all night he seemed genuinely caught off guard. The audience murmured. Cameras caught everything. Denzel didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply looked across at Newsom and said, "I'm not here to perform. I'm here to tell the truth." It wasn't the sentence, but it was close, and it was enough to change everything. Social media exploded. Analysts whispered in real time. Newsom's credibility just cracked. The clip went viral before the segment had even ended. Quotes, memes, reactions spreading like wildfire. And yet, the debate wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one moment left. One sentence waiting in the wings. By now, the shift in power was impossible to ignore. Newsom, once confident and cameras far sure, had grown defensive. His attacks came faster, but landed weaker. And Denzel, he had barely moved. But the contrast couldn't have been sharper. One man unraveling, one man already finished. He just hadn't delivered the final line. The moderator, sensing the tension, tried to steer things back to policy, immigration, education, infrastructure, but the nation wasn't watching for policy anymore. They were watching a reckoning. On the subject of immigration, Newsom tried to regain ground. We need compassion. We need reform. But we also need to stop treating immigrants as scapegoats for broken systems. Then, locking eyes with Denzel, he added, "And what we don't need is political theater designed to make people afraid." The jab was subtle but clear. This time, Denzel answered without pause. "No one's scapegoating anyone," he said, voice calm but firmer now. "But we have to stop pretending that ignoring the law is compassion. Real leadership protects both opportunity and order." It was the first time his tone carried an edge, and it was enough to rattle Newsom. "You want to talk about law and order?" Newsom snapped. "Then let's talk about your office blocking investigations into financial fraud in your own state. Where was your integrity then?" The moderator raised a hand. "Do you have a source for that?" Newsom waved it off. "It's public. It's all out there." But something had shifted. Newsom was no longer referencing reports. He was throwing darts, hoping one would land. Denzel waited. Then came the line that froze the room, not for its volume, but its quiet power. "Senator," and he said, "I've faced accusations before, but unlike you, I didn't hide behind lawyers or staff. I showed up and I answered." No applause. None was needed. It landed. Newsom shook his head, trying to recover, but stayed silent. The moderator moved on, hesitantly, but the shift was undeniable. You could feel it in the room. Something had changed. It wasn't just that Denzel had countered Gavin's latest jab. It was how he did it, by pointing to something Newsom couldn't touch: accountability. Not the type wrapped in PR statements or lawyer-reviewed apologies. The kind that's lived, owned, felt. And that's when millions of viewers across the country realized they weren't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a slow collapse. It wasn't explosive, it wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable. And still, Denzel didn't press. He didn't gloat. He waited. He wasn't looking for applause, not aiming to trend. He was setting the stage, and everyone watching could feel it. He was waiting for one sentence, a moment, a quiet door that would open the flood. The moderator moved into the final segment. The leadership round, typically a softer ending to a hard debate, a chance to sound presidential. But this wasn't a typical debate anymore. She offered them the floor. "What does leadership mean to you, and how have you demonstrated it in crisis?" Newsom went first. He took a breath, then launched into polished recollection. Wildfires, late-night calls with FEMA, community grants, recovery efforts. It was detailed, polished, almost impressive, but it lacked something fundamental: connection. Denzel didn't shift in his seat, didn't blink. He simply waited. And when it was his turn, he leaned forward, just a little, spoke slowly. "Leadership," he said, "isn't about how many press releases you send out. It's about the decisions you make when no one's writing them down." He paused. Let it breathe. "It's about telling people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear." There was something about his voice now. It didn't sound like politics. It didn't sound like strategy. It sounded personal. He spoke briefly about visiting a small town in Ohio. A man, a father, who had just lost his job, and told him straight, "I don't trust anyone in Washington. Not Republicans, not Democrats, no one." Denzel looked him in the eye and answered, "I don't blame you." That was the moment the audience stopped breathing, because what followed was something rare. A politician admitting that he had failed. "I told him I hadn't done enough," Denzel said, "that I'd listened more than I'd acted, and that I would do better." Then, looking squarely at Newsom, he added, "And the truth is, Senator, that's something you haven't said once tonight." Newsom opened his mouth but said nothing, because now the floor wasn't his. Denzel wasn't debating anymore. He was confronting. You want trust? He continued. Start by owning your choices. Because leadership isn't just about good ideas. It's about being accountable when things go wrong. The camera caught the shift in Newsom's face. Disbelief, then anger, then something else. Uncertainty. He adjusted his mic, cleared his throat, tried to rally, but the room wasn't with him. The tone had changed. For the first time all night, it wasn't about policy, it wasn't about history, it was about character. And all the applause lines Newsom had prepared suddenly felt small. Because Denzel wasn't playing the game anymore. He was leading, and everyone in the studio felt it. But the final moment, the line that would seal it, hadn't come yet. Not quite. The moderator looked down at her notes, then up again, her voice sharper, more direct. Mr. Washington, she said, earlier this year, Senator Newsom came under scrutiny for failing to disclose financial ties to a regional infrastructure firm that later received federal contracts. And then she asked it, the final question. Do you believe this undermines his ability to lead? Do you believe this undermines his ability to lead? Gavin Newsom immediately raised his hand, ready to object, but the moderator held it off with a sharp gesture. Silence fell. The question hung in the air like a live wire. Every viewer, every journalist, every campaign staffer, they all knew this was the moment. Denzel looked straight ahead. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. Then calmly he spoke. I believe leadership is about trust, he said, and trust is earned, one decision at a time. He turned toward Newsom, eyes steady. And when a senator fails to disclose that a company he privately invested in later received a federal contract after lobbying for it, that's not an oversight. He paused, just long enough. That's betrayal. Newsom froze, no response, no spin, just stillness. The moderator tried to move on, but Denzel wasn't done. I'm not here to smear you, he said. I'm here to tell the truth. And the truth is, you didn't tell the American people the full story. You let them believe it was clean. He paused, then quietly added, but it wasn't. Newsom found his voice, but it cracked. You don't have the full context, he snapped, desperate. The ethics committee cleared that situation. Denzel nodded once. They cleared the paperwork, he said softly, not the judgment. That line cut deeper than anything all night. It wasn't technical, it wasn't political, it was moral. It was the sentence, the one no one could unhear. They cleared the paperwork, not the judgment. It echoed. Social media lit up like wildfire. Clips exploded across timelines. News banners flashed. Washington confronts Newsom over ethics, the moment that ended the debate. Even pundits who favored Newsom paused. Some called it ruthless, most called it fair. Newsom sat motionless. The debate technically continued, but it didn't matter. The room had turned. The contest was over. Newsom tried to respond, but now his voice was slower, measured, hesitant. Gone was the command he walked in with. What remained was defense, explanations, timelines, legal phrasing. No one remembered them. No one cared, because they had already heard the truth, delivered with precision. And Denzel didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He had already said the sentence that couldn't be unsaid. Then came the fallout. News networks cut in with analysis. Commentators shifted. Even Newsom's defenders began using phrases like unforced error and strategic collapse. In the studio, the silence after Denzel's words said everything. Newsom's posture had changed. His timing faltered. There was a tremor in his voice. The debate was still happening. But the reckoning had already arrived. The moderator turned once more to Denzel. Mr. Washington, any final thoughts before we move to closing statements? He nodded. I think Americans are tired of explanation, he said. They're tired of explanations, Denzel said. Tired of carefully crafted answers and technical excuses. He looked out into the camera. What they want is character. Someone who doesn't need to be reminded that public service is about serving, not benefiting. The line didn't sting, it didn't mock, it reminded. And that's what made it powerful. Because at that point, Denzel Washington wasn't just debating Gavin Newsom anymore. He was speaking to everyone watching at home. Everyone who'd voted, hoped, and ended up disillusioned. He was saying, I see it, I hear it, I won't insult your intelligence. Sensing the shift, Newsom made one last attempt to regain ground. I've made mistakes, he admitted, his voice softer. But I've always put the people first. It was the closest he'd come to vulnerability, and for a moment, it almost worked. But then Denzel looked at him, not with contempt, with clarity. Then own them, he said, fully. Not when you're cornered, not when the cameras are on, but when it matters most, when no one's watching. That line settled over the room like a quiet verdict. The debate wasn't technically over. The lights were still on. The moderator hadn't yet closed the segment, but the energy had shifted entirely. The audience wasn't wondering who had won. They were wondering how long Gavin Newsom would pretend he hadn't lost. And that, more than any headline, was the real story. By the time the debate ended, the conversation had already moved online. Within minutes, Denzel's one sentence, "They cleared the paperwork, not the judgment," was trending across every platform. Clips flooded social feeds. Commentators marveled not just at what Denzel said, but how he said it. The silence, the timing, the restraint. More importantly, what didn't follow. No bragging, no escalation. Just a moral blow that echoed. Newsom never recovered. Major networks replayed the moment endlessly. Some tried to soften it, a tough but fair critique. Others called it what it was, a masterclass in timing, truth, and restraint. Even neutral anchors had to admit Denzel hadn't just won the debate. He changed the conversation. And outside the media world, the impact was sharper still. Polls shifted. Where Newsom had once been neck and neck with potential challengers, now there was doubt. Voters in California were interviewed that very night. "I didn't know about the contracts," one woman said. "But now I wonder what else we don't know." "I'm not a Republican," said another, "but I believe in accountability." Denzel had it, Newsom didn't. That was the key. Denzel didn't win with policy, he didn't shout, he didn't hit hard. He simply made people believe he wasn't hiding anything. And Newsom, no matter how many words he used, couldn't match that. Back in Washington, the ripple effects began immediately. Lawmakers from both parties issued statements. Some defended Newsom, others, quietly, distanced themselves. Inside Newsom's own camp, the question started. Could this have been avoided? Why wasn't he better prepared? Would there be fallout? The answer was already clear, yes, because debates don't just show how someone speaks. They show who they are under pressure. And when it mattered most, Gavin Newsom reached for spin. Denzel Washington stood in the truth. That night, Denzel returned to his hotel. No fanfare, no victory lap, no press tour, just one quiet statement released by his team. Mr. Washington said what needed to be said. On the stage, to the American people. There's nothing more to add. And that too went viral, because in an era of noise, spectacle, and never-ending commentary, silence, earned silence, had once again become the most powerful message. And Denzel Washington didn't just win a debate, he restored something, a piece of trust, a moment of truth, a glimpse of what leadership could look like if it stopped chasing applause and started chasing principle. He didn't hold a fiery press conference. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to because the country was already speaking for him. That night, editorials flooded in with headlines like, Denzel's lesson on leadership. One line that changed a career. Truth delivered quietly. And in homes across the nation, the debate didn't replay as a clash. It replayed as a reckoning. People weren't arguing about who won. They were asking something deeper. Who do I trust? And for once, the answer didn't feel complicated. In the days that followed, Senator Gavin Newsom avoided the spotlight. No major interviews, no defiant press releases, just a brief, carefully worded statement thanking the moderators and reaffirming his commitment to public service. But the silence, it spoke volumes. Behind closed doors, Democratic strategists were in crisis mode. Internal polls showed trust had collapsed. Donors hesitated. Endorsements evaporated. As Newsom tried to return to normal Senate work, the questions followed him through every hallway. Senator, do you still stand by your explanation? Will you release more details about the contracts? Do you believe Mr. Washington was fair? He gave the same answer again and again, no comment at this time. But the pressure was building. And then, behind closed doors with his senior staff, he reportedly said 6 words that leaked to the press. "I should have answered it differently." Not an admission of guilt, but one of miscalculation. He hadn't just lost a debate, he had misread the moment. He expected Denzel to come in swinging, to fight loud, to spar with sound bites. Instead, he was dismantled, slowly, quietly, by a man who never raised his voice, and the country noticed. Meanwhile, Denzel Washington's team was flooded with media requests, morning shows, magazine profiles, global headlines, but Denzel declined almost all of them. When asked why, his team released a single sentence. Mr. Washington said what he needed to say, on the stage, to the American people. There's nothing to add. That line too went viral, because in an era obsessed with spin, spectacle, and sound bites, silence became the most powerful message. And for Denzel, it was never about victory laps. It was about showing something deeper. That real leadership knows when not to speak. Back on Capitol Hill, Gavin Newsom began to quietly fade. Not because the issue was resolved, but because it no longer needed explaining. People had made up their minds. The debate didn't end with fireworks. It ended with clarity. And in trying to outtalk it, Newsom had only made Denzel's case stronger. By the end of the week, most Americans had moved on, but they hadn't forgotten. They remembered the look, the pause, the sentence, and that memory carried more weight than any future campaign speech could undo. Something rare had happened. Not a scandal, not a resignation, a shift, subtle, but permanent. Newsom still gave speeches on the Senate floor, still cast votes, but the authority in his voice was gone. Constituents who once defended him didn't get angry. They got quiet. It wasn't rage, it was disbelief. He had survived politically, but morally the damage had been done. All because of one line. They cleared the paperwork, not the judgment. It became more than a quote. It became a standard. Suddenly, journalists were asking other politicians, was it legal or was it right? College debate coaches began using it in lessons. Corporate executives referenced it in meetings. Editorials framed entire op-eds around it. Because it wasn't just what Denzel said, it was when and how and why. And that stuck. As for Denzel, he said little afterward. He returned to work. Focused on legislation, skipped the press circuit, avoided the spotlight, but the public remembered. His approval ratings climbed, trust numbers surged, and more than that, across party lines, people began using words rarely spoken in Washington: principled, measured, steady. For a man once called too quiet for the national stage, the debate had rewritten his legacy, not as soft, but as strategic, as honest, as undeniable. Years from now, when historians look back at that debate, they won't quote every policy or recall each question. But they will remember the moment, the breath, the pause, the precision, and one sentence that cut through the political noise like a scalpel. They cleared the paperwork, not the judgment. A reminder that when truth is delivered with timing and integrity, it doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. And on that stage, in that moment, Denzel Washington didn't just win a debate. He restored something, a piece of trust, a sense of seriousness, a glimpse of what politics could look like if it stopped chasing applause and started chasing principle. And that's why the silence after his sentence wasn't empty. It was full of everything people had been waiting to hear without even realizing it. Not spin, not spectacle, just one line.